Amen. Thank you for that prayer. If you got your Bibles with you, let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 27. 1 Samuel chapter 27. I would encourage everybody to open up one of the Bibles, either in the pew, on your phone, or maybe you brought it to church. Anyone you got. Maybe open up a couple of them, because I'm going to tell you that the next 12 verses, 1 Samuel chapter 27, has hit everybody that's in this congregation and watching us online right now. Because first chapter 27, oh my goodness, it's a battle. It's not a battle that we typically see. 1 Samuel chapter 27 is actually one of the more uncomfortable chapters that we read about in David's life. It's one of those chapters that it's not heroic like Goliath. It's not noble like sparing Saul. And it's not poetic like the Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's not one of those. As a matter of fact, this chapter we're about to look at is spiritually kind of gray. And that's exactly why it's helpful, because this chapter shows us something that's so deeply human. Even a man after God's own heart can have moments when his faith gets tired. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk slowly through this chapter, because most spiritual failures that we have, don't actually start with just outright rebellion. Most of the times we fail, it's because we're exhausted. Now, just so we have a little background, David has been hunted by Saul for years. He's been hiding and living in caves. He has slept in the desert. He has watched spears fly past his head. Twice he has spared Saul's life. Twice Saul has cried out to him and promised change. Twice David has walked away believing maybe, just maybe, things are going to settle down. But here we go again. And somewhere in the weariness of all of it, David reaches one of the more dangerous moments that we all reach. And it's a moment that he didn't reach in anger. And it's a moment that he didn't reach in lust. And it's a moment that he didn't reach in pride. It's a moment of discouragement. So verse 1 right here opens the chapter with the words that should make every one of us pause. It says, "And David said in his heart, I shall now perish by the hand of Saul." Now, I want you to think about this. David said in his heart, I shall now perish by the hand of Saul. For the younger children, that's saying, Saul's going to kill me. This is the man who killed Goliath. This is the same David who has penned the words, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, and whom shall I fear?" This is the David who wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." But now, he says in his heart, I'm going to die by the hand of Saul. So the battle is not happening around David anymore. The battle is actually happening inside of David. And that's one of the most dangerous battles that we'll ever fight. When Satan came to this earth the very first time in the Garden of Eden and went up to Eve and said, "Hey, the Lord knows that if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll know. You'll be like him." Now, if nothing else had happened, fine. That statement was made. It goes away and it evaporates. But what happened? That thought took seed in Eve's mind, and it started to spread like cancer. This thought has taken root in David's mind, and it's going to start spreading like cancer. David said in his heart, I want you to notice where the decision began. It didn't happen in prayer. And David said in his heart when he was praying to God. It didn't happen in counsel with good friends. It didn't even happen before the Lord. It began in his heart, and sometimes the most dangerous conversations that we have with ourselves. So David begins rehearsing this narrative. He said in his heart, so he begins to rehearse this narrative. Surely I'm going to perish at the hands of Saul. And that statement is completely inconsistent with the promise of God. God has already anointed David. Samuel has already anointed him, and God has delivered him from lions and bears and tigers of mine. David has already defeated Goliath. God has preserved him multiple times through Saul's rage, and yet David's internal dialogue is, it's not going to work out. I'm tired. Discouragement has a way of rewriting our theology, and it whispers, God helped you before, but this time just feels different. You know, God has delivered us, but this time I'm done. God has a plan, but probably won't work out for me. And here's the problem. If we listen to those whispers long enough, we start to believe them. And that's why Scripture warns us about conversations in our hearts. The Psalms say, as a man thinketh in his heart. This is the Psalm. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So some of the most dangerous conversations, some of the most dangerous battles we're going to have are going to be the things that happen in our mind, because the battlefield of faith is often the internal narrative in our mind. So David isn't defeated by Saul, but David is momentarily defeated by his own conclusions. And y'all, here's the scary part. The moment that David begins to believe that story, his behavior changes. Because what we believe about God determines where we run when the trouble comes. Let me say that again. What we believe about God determines where we run when the trouble comes. So after convincing himself that he's going to die, David reaches a conclusion, and it says right here, and David said in his heart, I shall now perish by the hand of Saul. Here it is. For there is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines. Y'all get that? Because this is a stunning moment here. I'm going to die at the hands of Saul. I might as well just go on over to the land of the Philistines. So David decides that the safest place that he can run is the territory of Israel's enemies, the Philistines. The same place whose champion he killed, the same people who once said, is this not David, the one that they sing about? The same place where he had to act like he was insane in order to stay alive. That's where David wants to run. Because sometimes when you get discouraged, you don't make the best decisions. And it says, and David arose, verse 2, and David arose and passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achash. It says in verse 3, and David dwelt with Achash at Gath, he and his men, every one with his household. So David had tried once before in chapter 21, pretending to be insane, living with Achash in the land of the Philistines. Not exactly one of his shining moments, if you remember right, because he was having to let spittle dribble down his face. He was out trying to have an act like an idiot. And so he goes back again. And why? And if y'all miss anything, I want you to hear this, because discouragement often convinces us that compromise is practical. Let me say that again. Discouragement often convinces us that compromise is practical. And David tells himself, well, you know, if I go to the Philistines, at least Saul will stop chasing me. And he's right. This is what verse 4 says. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought him no more again for him. So it worked. But here's the lesson. Just because something works doesn't mean it's right. David is an Israelite. And the world often offers us solutions that look efficient. The world can offer us shortcuts, walkarounds, workabouts, temporary reliefs. But the problem with running to the Philistines is this: you may escape your problem, but you lose the ground that God called you to stand on. The drugs may temporarily soothe you, but you're losing the ground that God called you to. The alcoholism that you're struggling with may dull the pain, but you've given up ground that God has given you. Running to the Philistines might get Saul to stop chasing you, but that was never your calling, just to have Saul stop chasing you. You were called to be the king of Israel. So what David does is he trades the wilderness of faith for the convenience and comfort of compromise. I want you to follow me here, verse 5 through 7. And David said unto Achish, if I've now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? And Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Wherefore Ziklag, that pertaineth to the kings of Judah unto this day. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines, dig this, was a full year and 4 months. So for 16 months, David dwelt in the enemy's land. David asked Achish, the Philistine king, give me a place. He gives him Ziklag, and there he is for 16 months. 16 months of not living among Israel, 16 months of living among Israel's enemies, 16 months of not living in the land of promise, 16 months that you don't see a recorded prayer throughout the entire period. And what's fascinating is how reasonable this looks. Because, look, David's not living wildly. You're not going to see him being broadcast, Girls of Gath Gone Wild. You're not going to see that. You're not going to see him settling for less obedience or settling for less trust. What Ziklag becomes is a comfortable place of compromise. But it's not where David belongs. It feels safe. But sometimes the enemy doesn't need for you to fall dramatically. Your life doesn't have to completely fall apart for Satan to be comfortable. He just needs you to get comfortable where God never called you to stay, in the relationship that you shouldn't be in. And it says, and David and his men went up and invaded the Gusherites and the Gezerites and the Amalekites, for those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, and they goest ashore even into the land of Egypt. And so you'll get a picture. He's in the land of Philistia. So he's going over kind of to the border of Judah, but he's not attacking God's people. He's attacking actually God's enemies from the Philistines. But let's dig on. Sounds good, right? But let's see what has to happen in order for him to do that. And David smote the land and left neither man nor woman alive, took away sheep, and oxen, and asses, and the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. All right? And Achish said, whither have you made a road today? And David said, against the south of Judah, against the south of the Jermelites, and against the south of the Canaanites. In other words, and you might not catch this, he's saying, I'm attacking Judah. In other words, David's lying. Oh, man of God, man after God's own heart. Verse 11, and David saved neither man nor woman alive to bring glad tidings to Gath, saying, lest they should tell on us, saying, so did David. And so was the manner all the while that he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So this chapter actually gets almost comical. David starts to raid Israel's enemy, and when Achish asked him, hey man, what'd you attack today? Well, I attacked Judah, and Achish believes him. Every single time, Tuesday, David, where'd you attack today? Judah. Wednesday, Judah. Thursday, Judah. Friday, Judah. Didn't once ask him for a receipt. Didn't once ask him, anybody survive? Any witnesses? he just believes them. It's almost comical. And Achish gets completely convinced. And then in verse 12, Achish says, he hath made his people Israel utterly abhorred him. So what Achish is thinking is that David has burned every bridge. And you almost want to say, hey, Achish, buddy, you're the only one that believes this story. But here's the thing about it, and here's the sobering part. Because a lot of us are justifying what David did. David is now living a lifestyle that requires constant deception, because compromise always multiplies complications, because compromise always creates new problems to manage. David has to maintain the illusion. He has to keep Achish thinking that he's loyal to the Philistines, and suddenly the man who stood boldly before Goliath is living a web of half-truths. And I tell you that because sin rarely traps us instantaneously. It usually traps us gradually. One rationalization, one adjustment, one explanation, until suddenly we're managing things we were never intended to carry. And yet, here's the beautiful part. Even here, God has not abandoned David. God is still working. God is still shaping. God is still preparing him for his throne. And there's not a single prayer of David recorded. But God's at work. Because God's grace doesn't disappear when we stumble. And one of the most remarkable features of 1 Samuel 27, if you read this entire story, God's name never appears. It's a silent chapter. No prayer, no prophet, no miracle, no divine intervention. Just David making stupid decision after stupid decision. And yet when you keep reading on into chapter 29 and 30, it sometimes becomes clear that God is quietly protecting David from the consequences of his own choices. And if David had actually gone to battle with the Philistines against Israel, the story would have just been a disaster. But God intervenes through the suspicions, and we'll see this later, through the suspicion of the Philistine commanders, and David is finally sent home. And the very compromise that seemed like a solution actually becomes a crisis. The compromise that seemed like a solution actually becomes a crisis that pushes David even closer to God when we encounter the cave of Adullam in just a couple of short chapters. And that brings us to this comforting truth. At least it's comforting to me. God's grace is often working even when his voice seems silent. Man, that's good. God's grace is working even when his voice seems silent. And the Lord does not abandon his people who are discouraged. And I know that's good news for some of you. Even when you wonder, even when you compromise, even when you lose clarity, God is still weaving redemption into your story. And what this chapter does is it reminds us of something important. David is not some cardboard box hero. He's a flawless. He's not a flawless saint. He's actually a real dude, real man, a man who would write psalms of faith and psalms of fear. A man who defeats giants, but also runs to Philistine cities. A man who loves God deeply, but gets so spiritually tired. And maybe that's why David is called a man after God's own heart. Not because he never stumbled, but because he never stayed away from God forever. The direction of his life kept bending him back towards the Lord, and that's what grace does. It keeps pulling us home. Don't know how many of y'all have read about marathon runners. I have. Years ago, I actually wanted to run in a marathon. I've given that thought up. That's a bucket list. Yeah, keep your bucket, okay? But when you read about marathon runners, there's something very consistent about all marathon runners. They say there is this moment, it's about the 19 to 20 mile mark, where you hit the wall, where your body is screaming, stop, stop, and your mind is screaming, stop, stop, I can't do it, I can't do it. And you just don't want to go on anymore. And your muscles burn, your lungs ache, your brain starts telling you something dangerous. You cannot finish it. And what every one of those marathoners wrote is, at that moment, the battle is no longer physical. It's mental. Your body still has strength, but your mind starts writing a story of defeat. And that is exactly where David is. He hasn't lost God's promise. He's lost the confidence that he can reach it. And sometimes faith fails not because the promise is gone. God's promise never leaves. But because the journey has been so long. So many of y'all are on the verge of discouragement because you've been fighting battles for so long. Don't give up. Don't give in. God's still at work, even if you haven't heard from him in a while. And if we're honest, most every one of us has a 1 Samuel 27 in the chapter of our own book. 1 Samuel chapter 27 season, a season where the fight has been long, where the pressure's been heavy. The promise feels so distant. And somewhere inside of us, we start thinking and start saying, maybe this isn't going to work out. And I pray that we don't run to the Philistines, but we run to other things like comfort, control. We don't run to distraction or self-reliance. We start solving problems. Because in moments like that, we can start solving problems without God first. Not because we hate God, but because we're so tired. David's story here reminds us of something that's deeply comforting. God is not surprised by our discouragement. He understands our frame and that we are but grass before him. And so the same God who sustained David through this wandering season still sustains his people today. I don't run marathons. I do go to the gym, and after the cancer surgery, it was a challenge going back. But I had those moments, and I'll do this 5 sets of 5 exercises. And that second set, when I'm done, my body is screaming, stop. My mind is making up every excuse why you don't need to finish all 5. You can stop at 2. You can stop at 3. You can stop at 4. But let me tell you something. When I do that 5th one, I'm so tired, but the joy of having been... Now I do it not for the physical. I do it just to prove I can. and hey, man, but there are some days when I stop on 4. And there are some days when I've stopped on 3. There are going to be days when you give in to your discouragement. This is why 1 Samuel chapter 27 is so important, because it points us to a greater than David. Because David, you read them and you might think that David's story is unraveling, that God's finished, but ultimately David's story points us to someone far greater, because where David was discouraged, Jesus remained faithful. Where David sought refuge among the enemies, Jesus walked straight into their camp. And where David wrestled with fear, Jesus prayed with sweat drops of blood, not my will, but thy will be done. He never lost his way. Jesus is our perfect king that David never was. He's the perfect king that David actually foreshadowed but never fully became. And because Jesus succeeded where David struggled, grace was able to come to each of us and to every child of God who stumbles. And that means when we have our 1 Samuel chapter 27 moments, we are not disqualified, but we are invited back. Back to trust, back to faith, back to dependence on a God who never stops working. And if you only read Samuel 27, 1 Samuel 27, you might think that David and his story is unraveling, but God is not finished. Ziklag is not the end. Discouragement is not your destination. Compromise is not the conclusion of the story, because God is still writing your story. And soon Saul will fall. Soon David will be called to the throne. Soon the wandering will end. But before the crown comes, David has to learn something that every child of God must learn. God's promises do not depend on your perfect performance. They depend on God's faithfulness. So if your faith is tired, if your battle has been long, if discouragement whispers in your heart, I want you to remember this, that the God who carried David through the caves and through the deserts, through the Philistine cities, through the compromises, through the conclusion, is the same God who carries his people today. Ziklag was not the end. Discouragement was not the end. Compromise was not the end, because God was still writing. Saul would fall, David would rise, the crown would come, but before the crown, God shaped his heart. And the same God who finished David's story is finishing your story. So if your faith is tired, if your heart is discouraged, if you feel like you're wandering into Philistine territory, lift your eyes, because the grace of God is already recalculating your path, and the story that God started in your life is not finished yet, because he's a God of grace. And we have Jesus. If you'd like to follow him as we do here at Camp Creek Church, we'll give you that chance as we stand and sing hymn number 358. We'll sing the first of the last stanza, hymn number 358.